back to American History 130, Day 5. The topic of lecture today will be colonial America. Like previous lectures, this lecture will also be divided into 3 segments. The first segment will address the southern colonies, the second segment will address the northern and middle colonies, and the last segment today will talk about imperial strife, that is, the competition for empire between, particular emphasis will be paid on the struggle between empire, between the French and British, as well as the indigenous populations of the continent. Let's begin. In the early 17th century, those Indians that lived in what Europeans would later call Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay lived in approximately 30 villages along the Virginia coast and were a part of a powerful confederacy called the Powhatan Confederacy, which consisted of about 9,000 individuals. The natives of the Chesapeake, like the people who inhabited the length of the northeastern part of North America, lived most of the year in small agricultural villages. As tribute for his protection and leadership, the great Powhatan chief collected food, furs, and skins from the villagers. He forged alliances with communities too distant or too powerful him to dominate. And the Powhatan chief also married the daughters of prominent men, dozens in all, to solidify his network of patronage and power. After 1607, however, the Powhatan chief and the Powhatan people were forced to take into account yet another group, the English, as this new people called themselves, came by sea, crammed into 3 ships. Who came by sea, crammed into 3 ships. They were 100 men and 4 boys. But let's turn back a few years before talking about Jamestown and lay some kind of foundation or address the issues that related to why it is the Europeans ended up in the great Powhatan chief's domain. By about 1600, other European kingdoms were beginning to view overseas colonies as essential to the nation's power and prosperity. Spain had set a very, very decent precedent with reference to. They did so in part because of an economic model known as mercantilism, which guided Europe's commercial expansion for approximately 200 years. Mercantilism called for strict regulation of the economy in order to ensure a balance of exports over imports and increase the amount of gold and silver in a nation's treasury. The primary objective of mercantilism was to enrich the nation by fostering a favorable balance of trade. Once the value of exports exceeded the cost of imports, its advocates argued gold and silver would flow into home ports. It was here that the idea of colonies entered into the mercantilist scheme. Colonial producers would supply raw materials that the mother country could not produce, while colonial consumers swelled demand for the finished goods and financial services that the mother country could provide. That logic led England's King James I to approve a private venture to colonize the Chesapeake Bay, a sprawling inlet of the Atlantic Ocean fed by over 100 rivers and streams. In 1606, the king granted a charter to a number of English merchants, gentlemen, and aristocrats, incorporating them as the Virginia Company of London. The members of the new Joint Stock Company sold stock in their venture to English investors, as well as awarding a share to those willing to settle in Virginia at their own expense. With the proceeds from the sale of stocks, the company planned to send to Virginia hundreds of poor and unemployed people, as well as scores of skilled craft workers. laborers were to serve the company for 7 years in return for their passage, pooling their efforts to produce any commodities that would return a profit to the stockholders. If gold and silver could not be found, perhaps North America, they argued, would yield other valuable commodities like furs, pitch, tar, or even lumber. In the spring of 1607, the first expedition dispatched by the Virginia Company founded Jamestown. Making the first of many mistakes, Jamestown's 104 men and boys pitched their fort on a swampy inland peninsula in order to prevent a surprise attack from the Spanish. Weakened by bouts of disease and beset by dysentery, typhoid, and yellow fever, however, they died by the scores. Even before sickness took its toll, many of Jamestown's colonists had little taste for labor. The gentlemen of the expedition expected to lead rather than to work, while most of the other early settlers were gentlemen's servants and craft workers who knew nothing about growing crops. Many colonists suffered from malnutrition, which heightened their susceptibility to disease. Only 60 of Jamestown's 500 inhabitants lived through the winter of 1609 to 1610, and as a result, that year became known as the Starving Time. Desperate colonists unearthed and ate corpses. One settler even butchered his wife. And that's the quote that you see on the bottom of the page. So lamentable was our scarcity, one survivor recorded, that we were constrained to eat dogs, cats, rats, snakes, toadstools, horse hides, and whatnot. One man, out of the misery endured, killing his wife, powdered her up with flour to eat her, which he was burned. Many, besides, fed on the corpses of dead men. Needless to say, it wasn't exactly a very enjoyable situation for the early settlers of Virginia. Others bullied Indians for food. Martial law failed to turn the situation around, and skirmishes with native peoples became more brutal and frequent as rows of tobacco plants steadily invaded tribal lands. Determined to salvage their investment, however, the Virginia Company managers in 1618 set in place sweeping reforms. To attract more capital and colonists, the company established a headright system for granting land to individuals. Those already settled in the colony received 100 acres apiece. New settlers each received 50 acres apiece under this headright system, and anyone who paid the passage of other immigrants to Virginia, either family members or servants, received 50 acres per head. The company also abolished martial law, allowing the planters to elect a representative assembly. Along with a governor and an advisory council appointed by the company, the House of Burgess had the authority to make laws for the colony. It met for the first time in 1619, beginning what would become a strong tradition of representative government in the English colonies. The new measures met with immediate success. The free and unfree laborers who poured into Virginia during the 1620s made up the first wave of an English migration to the Chesapeake that numbered between 130,000 and 150,000 over the 17th century. Drawing from ranks of ordinary English working people, the immigrants were largely men, outnumbering women by 6 to 1. Most were young, ranging in the age from 15 to 24. Because of their youth, most, however, lacked skills or wealth. Some of those who came to the Chesapeake as free immigrants prospered as Virginia's tobacco economy took off. When, in the 1620s, demand soared and prices peaked in European markets, colonists with an eye for profit planted every inch of their farms in tobacco and reaped windfalls. Indentured servants accounted for 3/4 of all immigrants to Virginia. For most, the crossing was simply the last of many moves made in a hope of finding work. Pamphlets promoting immigration promised land and quick riches once servants had finished their terms of 4 to 7 years. Indentured servants essentially were indentures were contracts signed between two parties, binding one to serve the other for a specific time. Even the most skeptical immigrants were shocked at what they found when they arrived in the Chesapeake. The death rate in Virginia during the 1620s was higher than that of England during times of epidemic disease. The life expectancy for Chesapeake men, for instance, who reached the age of 20, was a mere 48 years. For women, it was lower still. Servants fared worst of all because malnutrition, overwork, and abuse made them vulnerable to disease. As masters scrambled to make quick profits, they extracted the maximum amount of work before death carried off their laborers. An estimated 40% of servants did not survive to the end of their indentured terms. The expanding cultivation of tobacco also claimed many lives by putting unbearable pressure on Indian lands. After Powhatan's death, that is, Chief Powhatan's death in 1617, leadership of the Confederacy was passed to his brother, who watched year after year as the tobacco mania grew out of control. In March 1622, he coordinated a sweeping attack on white settlers that killed about 1/4 of Virginia's colonial population. English retaliation over the next decade cut down an entire generation of young Indian men and drove the remaining Powhatans to the west and won the colonists hundreds of thousands of more acres for tobacco. News of the ongoing Indian uprising jolted English investors into determining the true state of the Virginia venture. It came to light that despite the tobacco boom, the Virginia Company was plunging towards bankruptcy. Stockholders discovered that more than 3,000 immigrants had not survived the brutal conditions of Chesapeake life. An investigation by James I revealed the grisly truth, causing the king to dissolve the Virginia Company and take control of the colony himself, making it a royal colony in 1624. From then forward, Virginia would be governed as a royal colony. As the tobacco boom broke in the 1630s and 1640s, Virginians began producing more corn and cattle. Nutrition and overall health improved as a result. More and more poor colonists began surviving their indentured and establishing modest farms on their own. For women who survived servitude, prospects were even better. With wives at a premium, single women stood a great chance for improving their social status by marriage. Even so, high mortality rates still fractured families. 1 out of every 4 children born in the Chesapeake did not survive to maturity, and among those children who reached their 18th birthday, 1/3 had lost both parents to death. By 1650, Virginia could boast about 15,000 colonists, however, with more arriving every year. But Virginians looking to expand into more northerly bays of the Chesapeake found their way blocked by a newer English colony. That colony was Maryland.